What's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, Tread Athletics, and this is a super commonly requested video that I decided to just go ahead and make. In fact, I was working with some of our interns, and almost all of them have dealt with low back pain at some point in their pitching careers. And so, I said, let's just go ahead and make this into a video for everybody else to see. So again, super common issue. It's less talked about than elbow injuries, UCL issues, shoulder, labral pathology, rotator cuff issues. But it still is one of those things that's kind of really misunderstood, especially as it relates to how these things are caused in the throwing delivery and then in the weight room as well. So I'm going to hopefully add a little bit of color and context to that. Myself personally, I've dealt with every different type of low back pain that we'll talk about in this video. So I've really been through it myself. I've seen the impact of certain mechanical cues and variables on that pain. I've been able to troubleshoot and fix a lot of these issues myself and in the athletes that we work with. So I feel like I have a little bit of context to be able to talk about this in the specific context of the pitching delivery. So again, I'm not a PT. If you're suffering from chronic low back pain, definitely go see a medical professional, a physical therapist, a chiropractor. That's not what this video is necessarily about. It's about how does this all relate to the pitching delivery, and that's where I think we can provide some specific context. So there are 4 types of low back pain that we'll talk about here as far as I'm going to classify it. There's the flexion-based low back pain, there's extension-based, there's rotation-based, and there's lateral flexion-based. So you can go ahead and use the timestamps down below and kind of skip to the part of the video that you think is most relevant to you, but essentially flexion-based will be made worse with flexion and compression. So bending forward, touching your toes, really rounding at your spine, or any sort of hard impact, especially with flexion. Again, that's what's going to aggravate the flexion-based type of low back pain. Global extension, really hyperextending your low back, creating that compression on the posterior aspect of the spine. That's going to be your extension-based. Rotation-based, again, you're typically going to feel that while throwing, while swinging. So there's going to be either generally unilateral, but sometimes bilateral low back pain when swinging. Again, during that rotation and extension phase. And then lateral flexion, again, kind of a combination of extension and rotation, but again, typically going to be made worse from that side bending action, or that side bending action as it relates to your swing or your throw. So those are the main ones we're going to talk about. Obviously, there's other things that can go into low back pain, but that's what we're going to cover in this video. And it's really important to understand the cause and the mechanism behind why you're having low back pain before you go ahead and figure out, hey, what are some exercises, some stretches, some modifications to making your delivery, some drills to do to try to fix this. If you don't understand the mechanism, then what you could be doing could be helping, or it could be the exact opposite of what you need. So bending forwards, touching your toes, stretching your hamstrings out, that could really make flexion-based back pain worse if you just continually put yourself into flexion. Whereas extension-based stretches, McKenzie exercises, cobra pose and yoga, things like that, that could really make extension-based low back pain worse if you don't know exactly what you're dealing with. It's worth noting that with almost any type of back pain, you're typically going to get some sort of protective spasm. So when your back goes into this protective mode, everything around it will kind of clench down. You'll feel really tight. This is when people will say, I almost couldn't get out of bed in the morning, right? Well, why is that? It's because your body senses some sort of instability, some sort of issue or damage, and it goes into protective mode. It tries to protect the spine, and all the muscles around it will kind of clench up. And so that protective spasm isn't necessarily the underlying cause. So we need to understand both of it. That might need to be addressed and treated to loosen up the muscles, dry needling, lax ball work, etc. But it's usually not the underlying cause. It's trying to figure out a little bit deeper what led to this in the first place. So let's go ahead and talk about flexion-based low back pain. I have a ton of experience with this myself. I have herniations, L4, L5, L5, S1, and we'll get into my story in a second. But essentially, signs and symptoms of flexion-based low back pain. This is typically going to be central. So again, somewhere in your lumbar spine, but central. So it's not going to be way off to one side. Again, aggravated with forward flexion or compression, typically loaded flexion and compression. So just bending forward, touching your toes, probably not going to bother you unless you're specifically flared up. It's when that's loaded with 315, 405, 500-pound deadlift and the background's just a little bit. Or you're going through a power clean and you try to catch that bar and your backgrounds, or you're squatting heavy weight and your butt winks and you get that lumbar rounding, or you do a broad jump and you land in full flexion, super deep, and you just get that impact, that load on the spine in that compromising position. So that's typically when it's going to be injurious, is in those specific positions. This is typically not as relevant, or typically does not happen in the throw, right? There's not this huge flexion compression moment of the throw like you're going to see. This is typically a weight room injury. is what we're getting at. But one way to see, again, your PT or doctor will know how to do this, but palpating the spinous processes will kind of tell you which segment of your spine the issue is. So just kind of feeling for those individual bony prominences and feeling which one feels the most sensitized, that'll be your clue typically as to what segment, what level of your spine that issue is, whether it's L4, L5, whether it's L5S1, whether it's L3, L4. Again, this can all be confirmed typically with an X-ray or MRI. They'll be able to see if there might be some sort of disc issue going on. But again, this is typically discogenic or disc-related back pain. So the mechanism is you have discs, you have intervertebral discs between the two vertebrae, and when you go into that flexion compression, it puts pressure on the disc in a posterior direction, and that disc can actually bulge out or actually fully herniate out. And that can also lead to what's called sciatica. It can basically, that bulge can press on the sciatic nerve, and so sometimes there might be shooting down or tingling down the glute, down the butt cheek, down the back of the leg, and so that's some sciatic nerve involvement as well, although that's not always present. And so again, typically this is going to be some sort of disc-related pain. Again, most often a weight room injury. Throwing is often asymptomatic outside of in the middle of a flare-up. So for example, I have those herniations. I'm going to have those herniations for my life, right? But it doesn't mean it's going to be debilitating. We have athletes who have herniations. They've thrown pain-free for years. It's not an issue. It's just about being smart in the weight room. It's about being smart with some of these other variables that can really aggravate it. Again, this isn't necessarily a huge existential threat to your career. It's about understanding what can aggravate those tissues once there has been an issue. So again, you might have just irritated it one time, might be completely fine, not have a herniation, or you might have irritated it and just actually built up a true herniation over time. And this is going to be a more chronic, sustained thing where you just need to be smart for the rest of your playing career about what you're doing in the weight room so that it doesn't start to aggravate it a little bit more. Going over my story, mine started 18 years old. I was a freshman in college, getting after it in the weight room. We're maxing out all the time, not necessarily on the best program. Our strength coach maybe didn't know exactly what he was doing, wasn't coaching form. The classic story, we're doing power cleans. I'm maxing out, I'm putting up 260, something like that. I'm trying to catch it as low as I can. I catch it super low, my back rounds, I get the rep. And then the next day I can just tell my back, like something's wrong with my back. Continued to kind of be an issue from that point forward, where I was just really flexion intolerant. Deadlifts, squats, any sort of like depth drop or high intensity plyometric where there's really a ton of impact or load through the spine. And so that kind of was a recurring issue from that initial kind of like acute traumatic injury to the lumbar spine. But from there, I've learned to train around it, right? I've belt squatted 550 plus pounds. I've still vertical jumped 36 inches from that point forward. I've still thrown 98 from that point forward. There's all sorts of things you can still do after that type of injury. It's just about knowing what to avoid. And so, I'm not doing heavy compressive loading. I'm doing belt squats. I'm doing sled drags. I'm doing things like that where I know I can stay below that threshold where it will elicit pain. There are powerlifters out there who have herniations. They come back and they still go and squat 500, 600, 700 pounds. So it's not like it's impossible. But again, as a pitcher, it's just knowing your priorities and prioritizing, your performance and prioritizing your health. And it's probably not necessary to continue doing some of these types of exercises if you have a history of them aggravating you. So squats with a butt wink, that's a really common one that can cause this, or cause that flexion-based pain, or aggravate it if you do have a history of that. Any sort of deadlift with even a little bit of flexion. So slight flexion, lumbar rounding with 135 pounds, probably not an issue. But 450 pounds, 500 pounds, that's when it starts to become an issue. Even those slight micro movements into flexion can be an issue. Again, can be built back, but it's often not worth the risk reward, especially when we're talking about a professional pitcher who has a history of low back pain, who needs to be ready 2 months from now for, spring training. Is it worth the risk reward to have him deadlifting 405 when you could be getting the same training effect from having him belt squat 405? Right? That's the thought process that I want you to take away from this specific part. So what to avoid, obviously during a flare-up, but if you have that history of flexion and compression-based low back pain, some things just to be smart about to avoid so that you can stay on the field. One is high-intensity plyometrics. So depth drops are one that consistently, would flare mine up, and some of my players as well who have some lumbar herniations and disc issues. Long duration sitting. So this is a big one. Sitting on a bus for 8 hours, sitting in a car for 4 hours, Any sort of just sitting is, while it's not that acute, high intensity loading as in a plyometric, there is still that low load but high duration compression happening. And so just sitting, especially in flexion, for hours on end, and then you realize, well, why am I so stiff the next day? Well, you've continued to put that posterior compression, that pressure on that disc. And so again, that can still create the same aggravating issues, that same protective spasm. Any sort of heavy compressive or shear loading. So a shear loading would be more of like an RDL position right here. That's shear loading. Compressive would be more like at the very top, just taking that axial loading down through your spine. So something like farmer's carries with 200 pounds per hand, that's more of a true compressive loading. And then another big one that isn't often considered for guys with flexion-based low back pain is sleeping on your back in a soft bed. Soft beds are notoriously bad for really any of these types of low back pain, because if you're a side sleeper, you're just going to sink deeper into that lateral flexion. If you're a stomach sleeper and you have extension-based low back pain, you're just going to sink deeper into extension. But again, if you're flexion-based low back pain and you sleep on your back, you're going to sink into that bed and you're just going to end up in flexion the entire night. So having a firmer bed is super, super important, and it's not often talked about. What to do instead, some ideas. Squats and deadlifts. Again, you can get, my opinion, all the same relevant training effects with belt squats. So one example of belt squat, there's belt squat machines. I've done videos before, which we can link below, on how to set up your own belt squat. If you don't have a belt squat machine, you can get a simple belt and a loading pin and do this at most commercial gyms, or find a way to set it up. Heavy lunges, right? Lighter lunges probably going to be okay for most people. If that's not okay, then again, those can be loaded up with sled drags, heavy forward sled drags, lateral sled drags, reverse sled drags with a belt. And the idea is all that loading is essentially bypassing the spine, and it's going through the hips and targeting the lower body. The cool thing about belt squats, sled drags, you can actually target the lower body more than you would be with a squat or with a deadlift, because now your spine is not the limiting factor. So there's guys who maybe they can squat 315 because their low back is the limiting factor to getting that weight up, and you put them on the belt squat, they can belt squat 405 or 500 pounds, because now their legs are able to truly express what they're able to do, because the low back is not the limiting factor. So you can actually hit your legs harder with some of these exercises, and it's not at all a deterrent to being able to throw hard and being able to improve your velocity. RDLs, we can easily sub that out for glute ham raises, Nordic leg curls, physio ball leg curls, anything like that. Addressing tissue spasm post flare-up or road trip. So if you go on an 8-hour bus ride, your back is super stiff, and you're like, how am I going to pitch in 2 days? First thing is going to be addressing the spasm. Or same thing, you do a broad jump, you land a little bit in flexion and you feel it flare up, or you do a deadlift and it feels a little off. Addressing spasm is a piece of that. Dry needling is super helpful to reset that tone and eliminate that spasm. So talking to your athletic trainer, talking to your PT, to be able to do that, that's a huge piece of any sort of like post flare-up protocol, is hitting that a couple times a week with stim, specifically for the deep intrinsic muscles of the low back. So we're talking about your multifidus. We're also talking about your QL. So those are some important ones to have your PT dry needle. Lacrosse ball work can work if you don't have access to dry needling. So that's one thing. And then for flexion-based low back pain, extension actually can be therapeutic, very gentle extension. So again, we know that the flexion and the compression is putting that posterior pressure on the disc and causing that bulging action. So we're trying to reverse it in the opposite direction. So very gentle extension exercises, or on the ground doing very gentle press up type movements. McKenzie exercises, you can go ahead and look those up, can also be helpful to calm down a flare up for flexion-based low back pain. Isometric core stability. So Dr. Stuart McGill has a lot of research. He calls these the big three, but essentially he's picked a few different exercises for creating core stability in all three planes. So some sort of like front plank or anterior core isometric loading exercise to gain stability there, some sort of frontal plane, so side plank type exercise, and then some sort of rotational stability, whether it's a Pallof press, whether it's cable chops, something to gain that isometric stability in all three planes. So again, the idea with the iso core stability exercises is just to prevent some of that micro motion happening in the lumbar spine. So go ahead and look up the Stuart McGill Big 3 exercises. That's a really good place to start, especially after a flare-up. And then again, those can be progressed to more advanced anti-rotation, anti-lateral flexion, anti-extension exercises, again, like body saws, heavier Pallof presses, chops, things like that. Iso low back exercises. So this is something that I've been able to do to try to build up a little bit of tolerance in the low back. So, my thinking is if all you do is just belt squats and sleds and you never train the low back at all, then again, I think you are leaving yourself a little bit fragile, right? Knowing that for me, putting 225 pounds on a bar and squatting it, right, I'm going to be in pain for a while, right? Like my spine cannot tolerate that. I've tried ramping it up very gradually, 5 pounds a week. I've tried this for years and years and years to figure out ways around it. I can't handle that type of loading on my lumbar spine, but I can still find a way to get a little bit of endurance, a little bit of strength and resilience through there. So some things that can help that I've found is some sort of like isometric low back strengthening exercise. And a good one that I found is a hinged stand. So a single leg stand with maybe you just have the bar on your back and you go into a quarter squat. And so it's just enough of low back activation that you can stand there for 30 seconds, 60 seconds. You can start adding a little bit of weight, 45 pounds, up to 90 pounds, up to maybe 100 pounds, something like that, where you can start to gain a little bit of that endurance and that resilience in that low back and in those spinal muscles. And then another one that's helpful is high rep reverse hyperextension. Again, maybe be careful with this early on, especially after a flare up, but I found that makes my low back feel very good. The West Side Barbell guys swear by it as far as being able to therapeutically rehabilitate these types of like discogenic back pain issues. So high rep reverse hypers, I would not do that with weight, certainly early on. That's something to pass by your PT. But for me, that really feels good. You can really pump a ton of blood through those muscles, and that for me is a therapeutic action. But again, that's one to be careful with. But again, just some ways to start to train the low back again, even after you've kind of taken out some of these more aggravating exercises from your routine. So summary with flexion-based back pain, right? It's not a career death sentence. It's nothing like that. A lot of pitchers have this and are fine long-term, right? Ben Heller, one of our guys, right? He's dealt with similar things, similar kind of history as myself. And again, as long as we're smart, as long as we can program around it, he's able to throw completely pain-free and have no otherwise limitations on what he can and can't do. Again, it's just about eliminating that compressive, shear loading, especially with any sort of flexion moment as well. Flare-ups can be brutal. So if you're watching this, you have flexion-based back pain, you've probably at some point had a flare-up where you couldn't walk for a day or two, right? You had trouble getting out of bed, right? They can be brutal during that initial spasm phase where your body locks down. Again, it's trying to protect the spine and the brain first and foremost. Typically lasts 1 to 3 weeks. 3 weeks is a very, very bad flare-up in my experience. That's only happened to me a few times. Most of these are going to be significantly better 7 to 10 days later. You allow the spasm to release, relax over that first week. Again, dry needling, rest. If it's really bad, you go to the doctor, they might give you muscle relaxers, and then again, begin to slowly build back, taking away those aggravating exercises. Again, primarily about being smart and avoiding those aggravating movements, and you should be fine in the long term with flexion-based low back pain. Let's talk now about extension-based. So complete opposite category here. Signs and symptoms. The pain is most often central and pinpoint. So you can specifically point to where the pain is in your low back and replicate it with global extension. It might, if it's unilateral, which it can be, it's going to be global extension with slight lateral flexion to one side, right? And that's going to apply the most compression to that specific part of your spine. But the mechanism here is any sort of repeated hyperextension or repeated posterior compression on your spine. And eventually it doesn't like that, so it'll start as what's called a stress reaction. There will be contact on the back side of the spine, so there will be contact as you just continually jam up those facet joints on the back side. So it'll start as a stress reaction, and that can go on to what's called full-blown spondylolysis, or spondy for short, and really lead to more chronic issues at that point. But really it's a repetitive hyperextension mechanism. And so the question is, what are you doing to cause repetitive overextension or hyperextension? And so this can be a weight room issue. This can also be a throwing issue. And again, because we're talking about pitchers, it could very well be a throwing mechanics related issue, but we don't want to also completely rule out the weight room or weight room causes here. Spondy is also called a pars defect as well, so just so you're aware. And then again, that can start as stress reaction. I've had the stress reaction side of this. I've never had full-blown spondy, but again, I have had this mechanism of extension-based low back pain. So let's talk about the weight room first. These are some of the most common mechanisms or common form errors that can lead to extension-based back pain. Any sort of hyperextension movement. So up in the top right, we see a deadlift lockout. So this is a common one, is getting to the top of a deadlift, and instead of finishing with your glutes, finishing with your hips, it's finishing with your low back, and you're just leveraging and pivoting over your lumbar spine, L5, L4 at that point. So this is a hyperextension position, and you can imagine 4 or 5 in your hands, that level of compression and extension. Again, your spine doesn't like that. So that's a common one. Arching, excessive arching on a bench press, another common one. You're essentially just jamming up the posterior aspects of your spine and putting a ton of load through that. So you can imagine 225 pounds in that position, holding it for a 30-second long set. Again, spine's not going to like that. Some other common ones, glute ham raises or back extensions. So instead of lowering yourself down with your hamstrings and pulling yourself up, you'll see guys get to the bottom and then throw themselves up from their low back, and they're just putting all that pressure on their lumbar spine as opposed to keeping that pelvic positioning, rib positioning, and getting that motion from their hamstrings. Other ones, med ball soccer throws can be one. So any sort of running curl hop position where you end up in extreme extension to flexion. So that can be one. So if you feel pain in that position on any sort of soccer throw, again, even just right there demonstrating that, like that doesn't feel great on my spine, because again, you're just jamming your back into that hyperextension position. So any sort of arching under loads. So a Romanian deadlift, right? We've heard the cues, chest up, head up, but you'll see people doing Romanian deadlifts where they're cueing eyes up, chest up, and the entire posture is just this very extension dominant rib flare posture where those erectors are on, they're in hyperextension, eyes are up, heads are up, and you'll see that on squatting too with some people, as opposed to keeping rib down, hips underneath you, and doing proper reps. So you can hopefully kind of extrapolate that to what you're doing in the weight room. Think through it, think through all the exercise, and think, okay, is anything that I'm doing putting me in that hyperextension position, or is anything that I'm doing in the weight room replicating this pain that I'm feeling? And that might be your answer, that might be your clue right there. So posture can very much be a factor here, a risk factor. So if anyone watching has that really extension-based posture, anterior pelvic tilt, we'll talk about lower cross syndrome in a second. That's a huge risk factor here from throwing in the weight room. So if you film yourself turn to the side and just look at where your belt is facing, and you're dumped forward like this, and your ribs are pointing up there, right? Belt buckle's down there, ribs are up there. That's like the classic extension posture, just walking around like that. So what's that going to do? That's going to already put you in this predisposed position where you're more likely to end up with this posterior compression, because you're already starting off in that position. There's not any room in your lumbar spine to move when you're already in this position. When you're in a neutral position, there's room to rotate, there's room to extend if you need to, there's room to flex if you need to. You've got room starting from that neutral position. But if you're already starting in a fully extended posture, you run out of room very, very quickly when you go to throw, when you go to rotate, when you go to extend. So the postural intervention for what's called lower cross syndrome is typically, just to oversimplify it, we can look at it here for a second. Strengthen abdominals. So if you have a ton of rib flare, part of that can be turned off and weak abdominals. So it's strengthening the abdominals. Part of that can be tight hip flexors. So if the hip flexors are excessively tight, it can pull the hips forward. So part of that can be stretching out the hip flexors. Weak glutes. So again, if the glutes are weak and off, a lot of times, again, tight hip flexors will go hand in hand with weak glutes. If those glutes get stronger, you're able to get the hips underneath you. And then tight erector spina. So if you're constantly in that posture, what tones up? You can even put your hands here and put yourself in that posture and feel everything turn on. So you obviously want some strength in those muscles, but you don't want them to chronically be just metal rods chronically turned on. Again, that can create issues up the chain. Form intervention, again, on everything that you're doing, keeping that good core positioning. And what I mean by core positioning is neutral spine. So there can be a little bit of curvature. So right now I'm in a neutral spinal position. Right here I'm in an extended spinal position. Right here I'm in a flexed spinal position. So it's trying to maintain that neutral posture, whether it's on push-ups, whether it's on squats, whether it's on deadlifts, through everything that you're doing. This might require lowering the weight on an exercise, building back up, and doing it properly. If we get to kind of some of the throwing mechanisms here, again, it's hyperextension during rotation. Jared Weaver, just one example that comes to mind. I don't know if he's ever had extension-based back pain, but this is commonly the type of delivery that you'll see in athletes that complain of the extension-based low back pain. Is you'll see some sort of pulling off early and them throwing themselves into a ton of extension without control. They just throw themselves there and rotate violently, and they're just rotating on their low back. So again, this can be from poor core control, poor core stability. They don't have the ability to actually control their rotation, and so the core is just weak, and they just go to rotate, and they just yank off, and they yank into their low back. So the solution here is to, obviously there's a postural piece of it, the postural and strengthening piece of it, but it's to be able to maintain that pelvic and trunk positioning longer into the throw and during rotation. So instead of going down the mound and losing it, it's going down the mound and holding that hinge, holding that backside, and holding the ribs down until you actually get to the rotation of the throw, and letting that rotation naturally unfold from the ground up, as opposed to trying to force it and yank off from the upper half. Again, easier said than done, especially if there are some underlying strength deficits, stability deficits, or mobility deficits, right? You might understand what I'm saying, but not be able to physically do it because your body is not able to. So it's a multi-pronged issue here. Limits in hip and thoracic rotation can certainly increase the chance that your body is going to default to yanking into hyperextension. But again, the first step here is to figure out, what am I doing here that's causing the issue, right? Let's hone in on that. Is it the weight room? Is it your throwing mechanics? If it's your throwing mechanics, cool. I've given you some tools now to figure out, hey, postural considerations, strength considerations, and then some drill work and patterning considerations to try to fix this in your actual throwing mechanics. Inability to hinge as well will cause the body to search for power elsewhere. So if you haven't learned how to actually hinge and sit into the backside to create your power from there, and you don't know how to use that, right, your body's going to search for power elsewhere. It's going to search for power by yanking into extension because it doesn't know how to hold the backside, hold the hinge, and rotate from the ground up. So what to do? If flared up, definitely get a diagnosis, talk to a PT, see a PT, and follow their instructions until it calms down, ramp up slowly, ideally follow a proper on-ramping protocol with oversight from a coach. There's no need typically to stop loading compressively in the weight room as long as the posture is accounted for and your form is good. So usually it's not like these guys can't go back to squatting one day, they can't go back to deadlifting ultimately, they can't go back to these other things. It's usually just about getting that initial stress reaction or spondy calm down, which can take some time. So another consideration here, I'm going to tell my specific story about this because I've dealt with extension-based back pain twice. This is a more chronic thing that can take 3, 4, 5 months, depending on how bad it is, as opposed to some of these other types, which can just be like minor aggravations and be good a week later. In high school, obviously two-way guy in high school, so I thought that in my swing, I thought that to generate that power, it was basically like how fast I could throw my hips forward and get the power from there. I didn't realize it was about hinging, using the ground, riding it, and then rotating while keeping good trunk positioning. And so I was just violently yanking my hips through. And obviously it didn't take long before that started to aggravate my low back, because in retrospect, what was happening is I was just yanking into extension and just dipping and ripping and trying to hit bombs. So that aggravated my back. I essentially missed that entire season once it was aggravated, because every time I would try to calm down for a couple weeks, go back to swinging, I would re-aggravate it again, because that was the underlying mechanism. I was just continuing to pick at the scab every time I would go back to that swing pattern. So that was the first time, essentially missed that whole season. The second time, sophomore year of college, and again, same thing. I'm trying to figure out, how do I throw harder? How do I throw harder? And it ended up being the same mechanism. I was really trying to violently force my hips through and rotate my hips as fast as I possibly could. And your spine's not designed to move that way, right? It's designed to be much more of this natural floating, sequential transfer of energy, if you look at any hard thrower, any efficient thrower. And so I was a very awkward, jerky, forced, like throwing my hips through without control. And again, same thing. I was just jamming up my spine on the backside. And so ironically, I actually missed most of that season. I think I missed 12 weeks of that season. I ended up throwing harder in my return because I was so concerned when I was in my rehab throwing process to not aggravate my back again, that I actually was just trying to tell myself, like, relax my back, like, don't use your back, like relax the hips. And I just noticed as I was going through that return to throwing process, like I was suddenly way more free to let my hips get through and my shoulders stay back. And I wasn't trying to power my hips through. I was just allowing it to float. I didn't have back pain. I think I was sitting 90 in bullpens on the way back, which I'd never done that before. And the ball was just coming out differently. And for me, it was just a response of relaxing the hips, relaxing the low back, as opposed to trying to brute force my hips through. So that was a huge eye-opening moment for me and how I cured that extension-based low back pain. But both of these were from the swing and from the throwing patterns. They weren't from the weight room for me. So summary, most pitchers are going to be fine long-term from extension-based low back pain. If you have spondy, right, you might get a back brace. You might be told you need 12 weeks or 16 weeks off. Right? This can be a really chronic thing that takes a lot of time, depending on how aggravated you've made it. If it's a stress reaction, it might be 6 weeks, might be 8 weeks. That's, again, get a diagnosis, talk to your doctor. But hopefully some of these ideas can resonate with you as far as looking at what you're doing from a mechanical standpoint and a weight room standpoint. Let's talk now about rotation-based low back pain. So typically, this pain is going to be very low and unilateral. So you might feel it, just above your pelvis and off to the side, right? This is going to be your SI joint. Most typically, it's going to be glove side, and it's going to be as they get to rotation, as they get to right around ball release, and during the follow through. This is one example. I think this is Ryan Walker, just super crossbody guy. This would be like the prototypical guy you might expect to get SI joint pain. And again, no idea if he's ever had it before. But if somebody without this type of hip internal rotation, this type of thoracic rotation, right, there's a lot that needs to go right for him to be able to get out of this position and do it in a healthy way. Because to get super crossbody, land that closed, and still get back around, you're asking a lot of your SI joint. And so this is commonly the weak link in the chain when you get really closed off and you run out of room in your hip rotation, right? If you run out of room there and you run out of room in your T-spine, your body's going to get that rotation somewhere else. So I've maxed out what I can get here. I've maxed out what I can get from my hips. I'm going to get it somewhere else. And where am I going to get it? My body's going to start getting it from my back to get that final piece. Depending on your hip mobility, that can play a role. Depending on your thoracic mobility, that can play a role. Depending on your throwing mechanics, super crossbody guys or guys that land really closed with the front foot, where that front foot lands, 45 degrees closed or more, and they can't pull that off, those can all be risk factors. Easy way to tell, again, if it hurts throwing, if it hurts rotating, but trunk twists will typically cause pain. So if you're flared up, trunk twist at that very end of the range will typically be the thing that aggravates that side. I already talked about this, but again, crossbody, closed off front foot, or any sort of constraint drill where you start with your back facing the target can be a risk factor here. So more closely examine your throwing routine, because if turn and burns, where you start here, turn and fire, right, that might be causing you to end up a little closed off. Maybe it's a quick pick throw where you start here, cut yourself off, and still try to throw. Those types of drills are going to place more demand on your total available rotation, and you might be getting some of that from your SI joint, from your low back during those types of movements. So here's typically where that pain would be, SI joint. Typically it's going to require time to cool off, time to calm down, but this isn't always a very long-standing issue. So in a lot of cases, this can be a 2 or 3 week thing where it calms down. You start to address whatever is aggravating it, either in the weight room or in throwing, and you go from there. Some other things that might be necessary, one might be an SI joint adjustment from a chiro or PT, or dry needling or other mobilizations for that area of your body. So that's something to ask your therapist about. Again, establishing, is this a recurring thing? Do we need to make an adjustment mechanically? Is your delivery getting too crossbody, too closed off? Are you too limited in hip internal rotation? Are we too limited in thoracic rotation? What might be this underlying cause? Taking a closer look at your delivery. So opening up your stride might be necessary. Opening up the landing position of the front foot might be necessary. The degree of counter rotation can be a consideration as well. So pitchers that are super counter rotated might have a harder time getting around their front side and doing so cleanly. Identifying weight room factors. So the most common one here that I've seen is reverse med ball throws, although any sort of explosive rotation can do this. So a Kaiser, rotational chop, especially if they're fully just ripping it, gripping and ripping it and fully rotating through, that can do it. Any sort of med ball throw. So the one that's, in my specific case, aggravated it was a reverse med ball throw. Starting here, rotating around, throwing it into the wall. Again, you only have so much hip internal rotation, you only have so much thoracic rotation, and so you're gonna get the rest of that likely from somewhere in your low back. And so for me, that will consistently aggravate my SI joint if I do that specific exercise. So in summary, most pitchers are gonna be better relatively quickly from this 2 to 3 week type of return window, unless it's been super, super aggravated and super, super chronic. With rest, adjustment, and modifying weight room activities, modifying throwing delivery if necessary. Again, this has a pretty good success rate, and you should be all right. And the final one, lateral flexion based. So signs and symptoms, again, this pain is typically going to be low and arm side. So one way to replicate this is if you're having pain throwing, you can basically I'm going to turn away from the camera, put your hand on that same side hamstring, and move it down as far as you can. So reach down as far as you can. So it's that position of extension and lateral flexion, which is going to put maximum contact on that lateral posterior side of your spine. And so it's trying to avoid getting into that position in your delivery where there's that side crunching action as opposed to keeping that stack and getting that range from your actual hip. So our hip is designed to take up that motion, not our spine. So again, second you lose that neutral spinal position and start to dive too deep there, spine doesn't like that. And so that's the lateral flexion based low back pain. The cause, irritant, again, typically it's going to be over recruiting that same side quadratus lumborum muscle, QL muscle, so the muscle that is kind of partially responsible, obliques, QL, for that side bending action. It's over recruiting that muscle in the delivery, and it's going to be causing compression of the facet joints. So throwing cause, this is often going to be guys that have super uphill deliveries. So they have a ton of shoulder tilt, ton of trunk tilt, but they're not getting that from their hips. They're not getting it from their hips. They're starting to get some of that range of motion from their spine. So this can be a compensation for loss of hip internal rotation or loss of hip abduction. If that back hip loses some of that mobility, again, they're not able to get that range from there, and they're going to start getting that range more from their spine itself. So what to do? Again, there's going to be a spasm associated with this once it's really flared up. So dry needling and manual work with a PT or chiro, again, kind of good first step to reduce that initial spasm, reduce that tone, and specifically asking them, working through the QL, working through some of the deep intrinsic muscles, the rotatories, multifidus, semispinalis muscles that are going to be really, really flared up and toned up in this specific time. Address hip internal rotation, potentially get imaging for FAI, or this is a really chronic, long-standing thing. To kind of jump forward to my story for when this happened to me, my throwing was going great. I was throwing hard, and then somewhere along the lines, I started to feel like I was not able to still get the type of separation that I used to be able to get, and I couldn't quite pinpoint what was happening. But after the fact, what I figured out is that I used to be able to get all this range of motion in my hip, really load into my back hip, and create this insane amount of torque there. And again, I felt like my spine was neutral, and I was creating that torque from the hips, from the lower half. Somewhere along the lines, I began to get some hip impingement, and I lost that ability to load into the hips. So I lost some of that ability. And so my body was searching for that feeling of separation. And so what I was doing is I was trying to get that separation from my back as opposed to from my hip. And that's all it was. And so I started to have same side low back pain, again, off to the side, an inch or two from the spine, where I was getting that compression. I could feel that compression happening when I would try to throw. And so for me, it actually was the first signs of hip impingement. Even though I wasn't having hip pain per se, I was just kind of feeling like there was a little bit of a block in the hip, but I was having back pain. But it was actually the first indications a year before I ever would have hip pain that something might have been going on. So again, if there's a huge loss in hip IR, it's possible that FAI, hip impingement, might be in play here. So one piece to look at is hip internal rotation and just seeing, is there some sort of compensation happening from a loss of hip internal rotation on the backside? Because if there is that loss, your body might start searching for that tension, that rotation from the spine, from your low back. And that was the case with me. It was actually the warning signs of like a year before I ever had any sort of hip impingement, hip pain. I just felt like there was a block in my hip and I couldn't actually get the same loading from my hip that I used to. And my body was searching for that feeling of tension and separation. And so I got it from there. So again, a year before, I started having chronic low back pain every time I try to throw. Ultimately figured out it was from the hip impingement. I would just say might be worth seeing if FAI or hip impingement is in play, talking to your PT about that if you really just can't figure out what might be going on. Addressing core stability, addressing the first move. So the other thing that I've seen is if a guy gets too, I call it like side crunchy, but too side crunchy in their first move. Again, there's some degree of that's acceptable, and a lot of pitchers do it. But if it's like too aggressively side crunchy of a first move, the counter move to that can be side crunching into the spine on the ensuing linear move. So if your first move is excessively side crunchy there, then that counter move is likely going to be throwing yourself into that excessive lateral flexion position, and that's probably going to lead to low back pain on that same side. Patterning this rotational pattern with any sort of med ball drills or any sort of other plyometric drills, just to try to make sure that you aren't getting this range of motion from the spine, that you're able to keep that proper spinal positioning. So again, people might say like, what's the best drill for this? Well, just go through all the plyo drills you're already doing and ask yourself, like, am I maintaining proper core and pelvic positioning through that drill, or am I yanking into that position and jamming up my spine? So just an awareness of that stacked core position in terms of what you're doing. One good one that you might put in here is the kettlebell Clevenger drill. So again, something where you're kind of just adding an additional load to your upper body will make it harder for your body to get out of that stacked position. So again, holding a kettlebell here and going through your lower half move, again, will keep you in that more stacked position, because once you put a 25-pound kettlebell here, right, if you get out of that stacked position, it starts pulling you all over the place. And so it really helps you feel and maintain that neutral trunk and core positioning. So again, we already covered my story here, but again, those 2 times when I got excessively kind of side crunchy, and I've seen that happen before with other guys. And then when I started having hip impingement, but before it was symptomatic, I would start to compensate with my low back on that side. So again, I know I've thrown a lot at you guys, but those are really the 4 main types of low back pain that I've seen. I have experience with all of them. Feel free to drop comments down below. Again, not a PT, not a doctor, just trying to give some context. Hopefully you can take some of this information to the relevant doctor, PT, chiro that you have, and start to piece together what these underlying causes might be that are landing you in the athletic training room. Drop any other questions you guys have down below. Again, feel free to email us, contact@treadathletics.com with any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.